Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and today on Edgar Casey's area of NYC, we have Lynne Salomon MIceli. Greetings, Lynne.
Greetings, Hercules. Thank you. And my guest tonight is someone I've known for a very long time, Jane Buyers, who is now the author of 8 Septembers, A Woman on Wall Street from 9/11 to Lehman. This may seem like an unusual topic for this program, where most of my guests are mediums, spiritual healers, other various practitioners of esoteric arts, but I think it will become clear how Jane's story actually makes sense here. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks so much for having me. I'm
It's
really excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking about the spiritual aspects of my story. So thank you again.
great. It's nice to see you after all these, and we haven't seen each other in quite a long time. Jane was a managing director and senior banker with JP Morgan Chase for over 25 years, including those world-changing, terrifying events of September 11th and later the crash into the Great Recession. She was also a board member and the treasurer of ARE of New York during some of the time that I was the director of ARE of New York. So we were colleagues. And just for anyone who isn't familiar, ARE stands for Association for Research and Enlightenment, and it is the organization that preserves and shares the work of Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce, in case anyone doesn't know, was an American psychic and mystic who lived from 1877 to 1945 and gave over 14,000 psychic readings that were taken down by stenographer. And his readings covered topics including health and healing, spiritual growth and development, reincarnation, karma, ancient cultures, future prophecy, inventions, sometimes also business matters. Jane studied energy constellation work at the Personal Transformation and Courage Institute, also called PTCI, which I hope we'll get to talk about at the end, and also trained in family constellation work with internationally recognized facilitator Susie Tucker, who was a protege of Bert Hellinger, the developer of the family constellation. And very briefly, family constellation work is an experiential, alternative therapeutic method to uncover and resolve unconscious, transgenerational family traumas and entanglements. Jane was also the co-founder of Ideals at Work, with PTCI facilitators Wendy Rains and Mary Elizabeth Lynch. So hopefully we'll have a little time to talk about the constellation work and ideas at work further on. But I want to start with Jane's book about her years on Wall Street. And I'd like to just read you. There is a website dedicated to this book. It's called 8septembers.com. And I'd just like to read a little something that a reader said. What makes this memoir so compelling is that it is not just about how Wall Street operates, 9/11, or the collapse of Lehman Brothers, though all of that is gripping and educational. It is also about ambition, motherhood, duty, survival, resilience, and the complicated inner life of a woman trying to hold everything together during years of relentless pressure and upheaval. I thought that was a pretty good encapsulation of what the book is about or what to expect from the book. So Jane,
Yes.
Again, it's wonderful to have you here. You did not start out in life planning to be a Wall Street banker.
I did not.
How did that happen?
Yeah, so I went to college to become a social worker. And in fact, I was a social worker in foster care at the Angel Guardian Home in Jamaica, Queens. I also got married during college, and my husband was a musician who liked to gamble. And so our financial situation was not particularly stable, and that was very uncomfortable for me. So I reached out to my father, who was a successful businessman, and he suggested that I go into banking. He said it was a hospitable field for women, and that that the banks generally would train you. So I really had no idea what that was about, but luckily for me, he had a college friend who happened to be the CEO of a bank in New York City, Manufacturers Hanover Trust. And so I took an entry level job there, not knowing at all what I was getting myself into. And I was, graciously trained by some female colleagues. But I looked around and I saw that mostly men, but also women, but the people that went through the credit training program were getting promoted on a regular basis, like a conveyor belt, okay, every 6 months. So I said, I think what I should be doing is going through the credit training program. So I got my boss to sponsor me for that. And that was a 1 year training program. I went through that. And then I was placed in the utilities group, which meant I covered electrical utilities in the Southeast, which I must tell you, I found to be quite boring. So when I had a friend who said, "Oh, we have an opening in the Wall Street group," I said, "Great, I'll interview for that," not knowing at all what the Wall Street group did. And I was hired. And again, I was trained on the job by my colleagues and basically worked my way up.
And then at the other end of the story, you didn't leave Wall Street planning to write a book about the experience either, did you? It seems like you just wanted to put the whole thing behind you, but you said you had a friend who was a historian.
Yes. So, the period of time that I wrote about in the book, beginning with 9/11 and going through the financial crisis, I was the banker to Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and Bernie Madoff and a lot of other firms that were under duress during that period. It was a very traumatic time frame for me, not just professionally, but also personally. My parents had gotten divorced and they each got sick. My dad got dementia. They both died. My marriage fell apart. So there was a lot of trauma in that time period. And I just wanted to bury my head and get past it. But my friend, who was an author and historian, Christopher Moore, he's passed away, unfortunately, he kept telling me, "You have a story, you have a story." And he's the one, I didn't even, things were such a swirl. I didn't even know that I made the margin call to Lehman Brothers on September 11th. But he's the one who connected the dots, the historical arc for me from being downtown on 9/11 and then 7 years later in 2008, making that margin call in the same day to Lehman Brothers. And one day he asked if he could interview me for a play that he was writing about 9/11. And when I came home from that, I was all riled up. And so I started writing. And so it was more like regurgitation. It was just like, there's a lot of toxicity inside of me and I need to get it out. But when I decided that maybe I would write about it, I took a course with Gotham Writers. They're big in New York City. And I learned about memoir. But before that, I went to a Friday night drop-in group where they give you a prompt and you write for 15 minutes and then you can share it with the group if you want. And so I did that and I said, okay, so whatever the prompt is, I'm going to write something true about my life. And I stuck to that. But what I noticed was I could only write about myself in the third person, and I couldn't even use my own name. Like that's how distant I was from myself and my own experience. So it's been a long journey, about 15 years, in fact, to finish the book.
15 years writing on and on, like stopping sometimes and then coming
Mhm.
back to it again. Yeah.
Yes.
And although it's, again, you started out to write mostly about these events on Wall Street, but you eventually wrote a memoir that included also what was going on in not only what was going on in the financial world, but what was happening in your personal life as you dealt with your husband's gambling addiction and your father's Alzheimer's and being a wife and mother of two boys and all of that. So that how did I guess you couldn't untangle the two.
Yeah, I mean, so the reason why I thought about writing it at all was because I had a unique vantage point. There weren't a lot of people who did what I did. There certainly weren't a lot of women or a lot of mothers that did what I did. And because I was responsible for the entire department that serviced the Wall Street community, during the financial crisis, I was pulled up. So, like, I was not an operating committee level person, but I was in all of those meetings because my clients were all imploding. And so I got, sort of elevated in a way that might not have been great. But um, what happened was I knew I didn't want to write a business book. I was like, leave that to Andrew Ross Sorkin. I can't do the research. I don't want to write that. But I tried because I didn't want to look at my personal stuff. I really tried to, can I just write the business part? And it just fell flat. I mean, early readers were like, no. And a memoir is not an autobiography. It's not a life story, but it is a slice of your life based on, a situation or an event. And for it to really work, it has to be the whole story of that. So I had to, dig down deep and look at the personal stuff and get to a place where I was willing to share and be vulnerable.
And you did that amazingly well. I mean, with a great deal of frankness, and uh, it is, as the person wrote in that review, gripping. Parts of the story are really quite gripping. What I think you did very well is explain and sort of simplify certain financial concepts or certain kinds of transactions well enough so that the story made sense. Not, you don't explain them so much that we go, oh my God, this is too much, but you explain them enough so that the story makes sense. And I think that was a challenge, wasn't it? Finding that balance between like oversimplifying and then not explaining enough.
Yeah,
On the
it really was. And I knew I was writing for a general audience. And, the more and more writing classes and workshops that you take, and the further you get into your project, you get uh, questions and guidance about, well, who's your audience? Who are you talking to? And that sort of thing. And so um, I knew I was writing for a general audience, and I knew I was writing for smart people who just were uninformed or didn't know about this sort of esoteric part of the world where I was working. And so, in these workshops, I'm with a lot of creative people, and they're telling me things like, I hear dial tone as soon as you say the word leverage or so, some banking term or whatever. And they just, it just does not compute. It's sort of like a math phobia, a finance phobia. And so I really had to, and I had one of my sisters who kind of falls in that camp, really helped me with, I need analogies, I need stories, make it so that I can grasp it. And again, I know my readers are smart. They just don't need the jargon. And I forgot how close I am to that jargon. I mean, when I substituted the word leverage for debt, people are like, "Oh, I get that. I know what borrowing money is." So it's just like I had to distance myself from the language that we use in the business.
Yeah, and it works. As I said to you earlier today, if I had to explain it to somebody else after reading your book, I couldn't, but I could understand it enough while reading the book to understand what's going on in the story, and that's what you need.
Yes,
So
the reader really needs to understand the stakes, and the stakes at the end of the day were related to the financing techniques. And so I was like, I have to, and there were many financing techniques. I had to just sort of concentrate on one and, carry that through the story.
So the book officially starts the first chapter with 9/11, but before that, there's an introduction where you talk about how your family kind of fell apart when you were 15. And that, to me, it seems like you included that for a reason. It seems to kind of set the stage for everything that comes later.
Yeah, I mean, I think our families of origin are important for all of us, and we learn. I have my Susie Tucker, who you referenced in my constellation uh, training. She says, yeah, every family's like its own little cult. You grow up and you think that's the way the world is, whatever's going on in your family, and you learn certain adaptations and ways to behave and, how to be loved and how to get praise or whatever. And then you take that out into the world, and it doesn't necessarily serve you as an adult. But if you're not aware of it, you're sort of replicating this conditioning and these patterns, and you're out there and you're attracting that overbearing dad and that distant mother or whatever it is in your professional relationships. And so I was trying to uh, give people a little bit of overview of like, this is my story. And, I may be saying some things about people or relating certain situations, but this is where I was coming from when I entered that world.
And where you were coming from at that point was that your parents had sent you off to boarding school and not telling you ahead of time before you went to boarding school. Then they took off and moved to Hawaii, right? Is
Yes.
that about right?
Yes.
Yes. Where your father became a very high profile business person in Hawaii, right?
Yes.
You
Yes.
might,
Very high. Yes. Very high profile.
so he was the CEO of a company, which I didn't recognize the name of the one company, but I definitely recognized Mauna Loa
Yeah.
macadamia nuts.
The
Yeah.
name of the company was Sea Brewer, but their premier product was Mauna Loa macadamia nuts. That's the one that everybody recognizes.
So he was very well known in Hawaii,
And he liked that.
and yeah, and he had a lot of control of a lot of things, and that becomes an issue later on in the story when he starts to develop Alzheimer's, and you and your sisters have to do an intervention, and he's got all this power and control and a huge estate and all these things that have to be dealt with, and he doesn't want to let go, but he's not able to manage them anymore. So
Yeah, and I mean, I think that Alzheimer's is a whole different way into the story for people because it was absolutely time consuming. My sisters and I had to work together. We had to go to court. We had to get conservatorship. We had to deal with him physically and emotionally and all of that. We also had to deal with all of his affairs, including running the business, including his financial estate, which we knew nothing about. And we had to deal with his divorce. He was in the middle of a divorce from his second wife. And so I think that a lot of people get stuck in that sandwich generation where they're raising children and they're caring for parents and they're trying to hold down a full-time job and life is really coming at them from all sides.
right, and life was definitely coming at you from all sides. So your family, your father particularly had this ethos about being strong and being in control and always giving the impression of being a happy, successful family. So it seems like you had a lot of difficulty acknowledging weakness or problems or sharing and with anybody some of the
Yeah.
things that.
We definitely came from, a don't talk about your problems ethos. I think even though my background is WASP, I mean, I know Italian people and Jewish people. I mean, there's a lot of people whose cultures are like, we don't talk about our problems. Um, and so what I realized was how much guilt and shame was sort of running the show for me. Keeping secrets, not telling anybody about my husband's addiction, not telling anybody about my unhappiness or my inability to cope. And so I was very good at my job and I was very good at spinning the plates and, being in charge and being the treasurer at the ARE and doing my job and, all of those things. But to a certain extent, that's distraction, right? It prevents us from stepping back and observing and learning and becoming self-aware. And so eventually, you hit rock bottom for a reason.
Yeah, my memory of you as the treasurer, a board member for area of New York, you were like a consummate professional. And reading the book, I had no idea you had a temper. Apparently, from the book, you have a bit of a temper. I never heard you use a four-letter word, but there are a few of them in the book. So this was a whole other side of Jane that was very interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
So
We never have the full story. That's another thing you learn when you write a memoir is we really don't have the full story. We don't know about what's going on with the other people in our lives, no matter even how well we know them or don't know them. We just don't have the full story. We're only looking at things through our own lens and as much information as we have.
so you getting into the book, you were in the Chase Manhattan building on September 11th that morning,
Yes.
and your building was not hit, but
No, no, yeah. The Chase Manhattan building is 4 blocks basically to the east of the Trade Center. So I was at my desk. We were on the 21st floor. I was at my desk and I was on the phone with my sister. And all of a sudden there was this like loud noise and the building shook. And I was like, okay, that's not right. I have to, I got to hang up. I got to find out what's going on. And I went and looked out the windows across the way, and I really couldn't see anything uh, because the building across the street was in the way. But I could tell that there was confetti in the air. I thought maybe a bomb went off, maybe something happened, and I went back down the hall to check in with my boss, and he said that the CNN or whoever was reporting that a commuter jet flew into the trade center. Um, and then some of my colleagues came in and they commute through the Trade Center and they were like, oh no, that was a jet plane. We saw it hit. And so we were trying to figure out what that was all about. Uh, and then the second plane hit. And my boss said, okay, this is not an accident. Get out of the building. But at the same time, the loudspeaker system was saying, we're not evacuating. So it was kind of a free for all. Who's going to go? Who's not going to go? I'm claustrophobic. I don't get in crowded elevators. So I was like, I'm not going. I'm staying put. And then, eventually I said, oh, I should go downstairs and see what's happening. And when I went downstairs on the plaza, I could see I could see the building. I could see the second tower on fire. And there were papers at my feet where I could read the names of my clients who were at the trade center. So it was all very, very disorienting.
very,
Um, I did end up going back upstairs with a colleague. So I was inside when the towers fell, which was also, it was like, I say it was like being inside the cyclone in The Wizard of Oz because the building was enveloped in this dark fog. You couldn't see anything. And when it was so loud, I was right next door to the Federal Reserve Bank. So I initially thought that somebody was bombing the Federal Reserve Bank. And so I went to the windows to look, and people were like, get away from the windows. So we all kind of hid in the center core of the building until we could figure out what was happening. And eventually they came and evacuated us probably about 12:30. And we just walked uptown, and it was amazing.
but before you finally evacuated, you were working, right? Because there were
We were
lots of phone calls and all sorts of things to
We
manage.
were working. So my job was funding the broker dealers, and so that what that meant was all the stocks and bonds that get traded every day down on Wall Street have to be paid for at the end of the day, and so the bank is very much involved in that, and we're basically trying to achieve settlement every day. And so by a certain time. And so we had clients calling us, trying to figure out what was going on. We had people from uptown trying to find their family members or colleagues, figure out what was going on. And we had our own family members calling us. So, and then we had this strange phenomena where at first we were like, how come the women's phones are working and the men's phones aren't? But it was because the Verizon building came down. But what happened was it was like the even numbers were working and the odd numbers were not working. So, we that was just the beginning of the technological problems that we faced. But yes, we were working, and when we walked uptown, I actually went to one of my clients and got set up in one of their offices so we could continue working.
Because I see, I lived in the city then, of course, and I was very much aware of the fact that some firms' offices were completely obliterated, and the loss of lives and the loss of jobs. But what I didn't really realize, wasn't tuned into, was the loss of information. That there were all these transactions that were in progress, and all the information about them was lost, documentation about them was lost. Not all of it was digital at that time, so some of it was on paper or whatever. And you kind of got stuck. There was a situation where you either picked up the debt for certain things, and not you personally, but JP Morgan, or if you didn't, an entire nationwide financial crisis could come about. So
Yeah, we were definitely instructed by the head of the bank and the head of the country, really, from the presidents on down, the president of the country, the president of the bank, the president of the bond market, that everybody was basically saying you have to keep the financial markets functioning, because particularly the US government bond market, because it is the underpinning for our own economy and also the global economy. And so one of the big things that we did was finance the payment of the movement and the payment of government bonds between the professional brokers and between their clients. And that the stock market closed after 9/11, but the bond market never closed. And so and every day we had to settle the trades from the day before, and some trades that happened on the same day. And the normally you'd get an instruction from the client, buy this in, send this out, and we would match it, and we would say, okay. But what happened was we had all the securities were coming in, but all of the instructions were lost. And so the decision was made by the bank that we would accept the securities because, well, one of the other problems was that the other bank that was our main competitor that did the same thing was the Bank of New York, and they were out of commission. They were right next to the Trade Center and the Verizon building, and so they went out of commission, and their backup systems weren't working. And so, the decision was made to sort of reduce the chaos, that we would just let all the securities come in and we would pay for them, and the Federal Reserve, who basically provided the funding for us to pay for them, said, yes, we have the money is here and we will fund JP Morgan, and JP Morgan will have all these bonds and we'll figure out later who they belong to and where they go.
And part of the reason for doing that was just to keep the entire financial system of the nation from going into free fall.
Correct.
Which actually happened years later, but
Yeah.
but not then. So you made an effort to incorporate some of the principles from the CAYCE'S material into this story. Well, you were trying to incorporate them into your life, and at one point in the story, you were having difficulty with your boss at work, and your minister gave you a suggestion for dealing with him. But in your comment in the book was that it was very much like the kind of experiment that's used in Search for God groups, the Edgar Cayce Search for God groups. And maybe we should very briefly explain what they are. They're small groups that work together, studying spiritual principles that are in a book called The Search for God, which was based on a series of Cayce readings. And these groups usually choose, each week they choose an experiment of some kind, a spiritual experiment that they're going to apply. So,
right.
Talk about.
Yeah, I'll tell you about that. So, I went to see my minister because I really was struggling with this particular boss, and and he asked me, would you categorize this person as an enemy? And I said, well, he's not an enemy like he's out to get me, an enemy, but he's an enemy in that he's an obstacle to my spiritual growth. I'm impatient and I'm rude, and he does not bring out the best in me. Let's just put it that way. And so, he very gently said to me, well, do you think Jesus had anything to say about your enemies? I say, yes. Okay. So he said, whatever, pray for your enemies. Do you think you can do that? And I was like, yeah, okay, I can do that. But I wanted to supplement it with the Casey work. So Mark Thurston had written the book Experiments in a Search for God, and so I looked in there to see, what could I do? And he had one. It was, based on the Casey readings, but that if the person that you're having difficulty with, find 10 good things about them for 7 days in a row. So I did that. And I did that along with the prayers. And then I got to the end of the week and I was like, okay, Doug's not any different. But I was different. My feeling, it diffused my anger and I was able to step back and see him more objectively. So it felt miraculous to me at the time because I was really stuck.
And he became your supporter. So
He
he was your
did. He
he was
did.
your boss. And when he decided that he'd had enough of Wall Street and was leaving, he actually suggested you for the job, promoted you for that job.
That's right. And then he mentored me because when I got the job, which I wanted, although I was conflicted about it, as many women are, but anyway, I was conflicted, but I wanted it. But I was overcome with insecurity. The more that I found out about what I was supposed to do, just the less my legs were under me. And so he mentored me, and told me I was smart enough and able enough, and I would get there. But it was an eye opener.
So that was so all of that in your book is in a chapter you titled Opportunity. And I couldn't help noticing that opportunity is one of the chapters in the Search for God books as well.
Well,
Um,
that is just serendipity because I did not plan that, but yeah, there you go.
but that was a huge opportunity. You
It
became
was.
the head of the department.
Yes, it was a big jump from being in a cubicle and a peer to then having the corner office and being the boss of 45 people, one of whom had been my immediate supervisor. So it was a big adjustment. It was a big adjustment. And
And and you're a woman in what you describe as a very macho culture. So how did you cope with that?
well, when I first joined Manufacturers Hanover in 1982, okay, that was a real shock to the system. I'd gone to a women's college. I had been a social worker, which was predominantly women. And, I was coming into the, world where the bankers would be like, okay, you bring a hooker and a bottle of booze and you go call on your clients, or there's Jello wrestling, or there's, I mean, it was kind of crazy the things that were going on in the 80s. I personally was pretty fortunate that my colleagues and my bosses were uh, very supportive of me. I mean, I remember our group used to host a golf outing, and I'd be like, "Oh, I can't go out and play with all those good guys." And it was my male colleagues who said, "Oh, most of them are terrible. Come, have fun, come, 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 come." And so I had enough supporters to really help me advance my career. But the Gestalt is one way, right? It's sort of a very macho culture, like we got to win, we got to win. I always be like, well, what are we winning? Like, what are we, what does that mean? We got to beat this, we got to win, but like, what are we striving for? And it was not always in alignment with what I personally wanted.
In your position, you needed to go out and like drink with the guys. You like you said, you had to go and golf with them, but that was a lot happened on the golf course
Yes,
that interest.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it not as much now, but because the industry has changed a lot, but it's really a relationship business. So, and that's where my social work skills, held me in good stead because I was able to have, good relationships. And, people would say, "Are you a good golfer?" I'd said, "I'm fun to play with." I know when to pick up and, I'm amusing. So,
Well, that's a good answer. You
yeah.
also talk in the book about trying to choose love versus fear.
Yes. Yes, that was something that my minister used to talk about a lot, and particularly in the wake of 9/11. And so, the way he framed it was, there's two things. There's love and there's fear. So I really try to make love-based decisions and not fear-based decisions. And in fact, even like with my current husband, when we started dating, neither one of us wanted to get married. We've both been, divorced and singed and didn't want to do that. But eventually it felt like not getting married was based on fear of repeating the past, as opposed to the next logical step, the outgrowth of our love. And so we got married. And it's great.
Good, good.
Thank you.
So as the story moves closer to September 15th, 2008, which is what they call, I read up a little bit on this. They call that the crash of '08 or the Lehman shock. It
Yeah,
seems
that's when
not
that,
only
yeah, that they filed for bankruptcy, right? Our margin call was on September 11th. We told them that they needed to give us $5 billion of cash for us to continue banking them by the next morning, by September 12th. And then, which I think might have been a Thursday. Anyway, Monday night they filed for bankruptcy. Yeah.
and at that point, it's in the story. It seems like both the financial world and your personal life were completely spiraling out of control. And in a work of fiction, um, that's often done in works of fiction where one part is an analogy for the other. But this wasn't fiction. This was your
It,
life.
it wasn't fiction. It was, I mean, I would point to, in astrology, they say as above, so below. And in spiritual energy principles, they talk about the inner and the outer being reflections of each other, or even, all is one. But yeah, it was definitely, I was certainly not the only person. I mean, when I look back and think about that period of time, I feel like it was like somebody took an apple tree and shook it, and apples went flying everywhere, because so many people's lives were in disarray from that time period.
The pressure, I mean, of handling making decisions about billions of dollars, handling billion-dollar transactions. That is, hard for me to even think about.
Yeah. I think it is hard for people. I mean, this country has $37 trillion of debt, and I think it's very difficult for people to wrap their heads around that and understand what that means.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, I can't even really think what that means, but I know it's not good. I know.
Yeah. Especially when interest rates go up, because you have to pay interest on that debt. I mean, to a certain extent, it's like, it's like living on your credit card. So there's a certain amount of living on your credit cards that can make your life a little bit better. You can have a few more things, but you can manage the payments. But if the terms of the payments change, the interest rate goes up, or the time period, right after when the 2008 shock, like a lot of people found out all of a sudden the banks cut their home equity lines. So people had, terms could change suddenly. And when the terms change suddenly, it can really upset your apple cart. And we've been in this very, very low interest rate environment for, from the crash all the way through COVID. And so the interest payments on that $37 trillion is less. But now, I mean, interest rates are more like 4 and 5%. And so the amount that the country has to pay to service that debt is higher, and it's a higher proportion of the overall budget for the country than it was a couple years ago. So.
That is something I had no clue of, and probably most of us have no clue.
hmm Yeah, so in some ways, I really hope that my book makes some of these concepts accessible to people in a user-friendly way. And yeah, my other hope is that uh, that they see the human side of the people that work in the industry. I know when I came from social work and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go work for all those bad banker people, you know? And I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of really nice people that work here. I should not have been shocked, but that was just sort of my tunnel vision from being in the world of social work. And yeah, so there was there's a lot of really good people. Yes, there are your greedy people and your bad apples and all of that, but there are also a lot of really good people, and we're all struggling with our personal issues.
Yeah, you were mentioning astrology a moment ago, and
Mm.
that made me think about how in the middle of all of this financial transactions, Wall Street history that's going on around you, you went to a psychic. That was an interesting. You said that
Yeah.
in the book that you said you were you were in therapy, but you were trying to take a shortcut, maybe get get something out of this psychic that would, shortcut the process. And actually, it sounded like you did, except maybe you weren't. What she said to you about your marriage.
Yeah, it was, yes, first of all, I've always been interested in psychic phenomena and I, being involved with the ARE and everything. I'm open to all of that. And I just happened to, she was actually had an office in my dentist's office. So, in, the office building. And so I just happened to know about that. And then I thought, oh, I'm having this issue. I got problems in my marriage. I'm feeling attractive to this other person. Like, let me see what, maybe the psychic has all the answers, which of course is not the right approach. But she did have some insights, and she did help me to see some things, even if I was not able to absorb them in the moment. But I certainly, I mean, how many years ago was that? And I still remember that whole exchange with her, and a lot more that's not in the book about that. Um, yeah,
Yeah, she zeroed in on your anger at your husband and the fact that you had to do something about that, or your marriage wouldn't survive. And of
right.
course, that had to do with your husband's gambling addiction, which you couldn't acknowledge to anybody, not even your family members. It was all this huge secret. So
Yeah, and yeah, so keeping all of that in and not expressing my anger. I was raised in the Christian faith, and you're supposed to forgive and you're supposed to turn the other cheek, and y- you know there's not a lot of instruction about how how to do that without becoming a doormat, and so Mary Elizabeth has a term, early holy, so, and it's kind of like, okay, yeah, you're forgiven, but meanwhile, pushing down the anger, pushing down the frustration, not acknowledging. And, I'm not blameless either. I didn't, I should have held him more accountable, and, so there's a lot that goes into the codependency of an addiction.
that's interesting, that term early holy. It's like you're trying to get spiritual too soon. Like you haven't dealt with what's
Yes,
with
exactly. It's like some people call it spiritual bypass, but yeah, but it's sort of like I want to channel the divine, but I'm not dealing with the fact that the dog pisses me off. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, you got to deal with your thing that's right there in your face before you can get to the higher ground. At least that's been my experience.
that's a good lesson for, I think, a lot of new age people, because there are, it's always sort of troubled me that there are a lot of people in the new age who think that everything has to be sweetness and light or you have to act as if everything is sweetness and light all the time. And, even Jesus didn't do that,
Right.
so
Yeah, and you we need a very strong foundation in order to face that shadow side, right? So we really, in order to have the courage to face sort of the darkness or the shadow sides, and really find a way to incorporate it, we have to be in touch with our own goodness. And that's really where the ideals work with CAYCE comes in, because really uh, being in touch with what makes us unique and beautiful and good, and really calling on that energy then allows us to turn and face the more challenging things in our lives. You know, we have like arrows in our quiver to deal with them, as opposed to just collapsing and being overwhelmed.
Be in touch with the good in yourself, but also acknowledge that you're not a saint and that you have some flaws, perhaps.
Yeah.
Possibly, yes. A
Yeah.
few. So as leading in the years leading up to September 2008, you actually tried sometimes to warn other people in the industry about weaknesses you saw in the system, and that wasn't very well received.
Yeah, I don't think I was prescient at all or anything like that. I just uh I felt that there were reasons that we ran the business the way that we did, and they were sort of battle tested from, I mean, the financial industry is very cyclical. I can remember when I started on Wall Street in 1987, my boss at the time, he gave me a list. He gave me a list of 25 firms. He says, these were the 25 firms that were here when I started. There were only two left. Okay. Because they're constantly merging, changing, failing, etc. But the way that our department was organized was very similar to how other banks did it, and it was sort of like a tried and true way to do things. And the bank that I became part of was the result of multiple mergers, and it got too big. And so they wanted to break up my group and reorganize things. And I don't know exactly how things would have played out differently, but I did feel that there was a reason that we were doing it that way. It wasn't that I was trying to, protect my fiefdom, which is how I was kind of treated. Like I was against change, and I would be the first to admit I don't like change. None of us do like change. I've had to, learn how to do that. But um, I had my little area of expertise, and I tried to help people understand what it was, and sometimes they got it and sometimes they didn't.
You had all the people together who would assess risk and assess the other partners in any kind of transaction, the risk that was involved with them, and then your department was sort of scattered all over the place, so that you weren't all together working together anymore. That
Correct.
did,
And so we
yeah.
had less visibility into what was going on with the clients and less sort of control over cash and securities and where things moved. But that's just, that's the way of the world, unfortunately.
Yeah, so much of your story comes right out of the headlines because reading your story, I remember that there was Enron
Yes.
before the
Not
big
not my
crash.
industry. That was the utilities industry that I left
Yeah,
back in the
yeah, but
nineteen 80s.
it was I guess a small shock, and then there was Bear Stearns, which I was barely aware of, but they went bankrupt
Yeah, JP
and
Morgan bought them. Yeah.
bought them, and that saved them. That saved that from becoming a huge
Mhm.
crisis for the country.
Right.
Um,
And the regulators just didn't want to do it for Lehman. I mean, Lehman was late to the party in terms of acknowledging that they had issues, and they didn't make a deal. They alienated people, and the regulators were just said, that's it, we're going to let them go. And it was not particularly well coordinated, because the US regulators were not necessarily talking to the UK regulators. And a lot of the business that Lehman did, they did back to back between their US entity and their UK entity. And so there was a lot that spiraled out of control because of that lack of coordination.
so, and you were right in the thick of that. I remember you coming into the office at the ARE Center telling us about how you had spent the whole weekend at work, Saturday and Sunday, all day, trying to figure out the situation with Lehman. And I remember that surprised me because I kind of thought bankers had what they used to call bankers' hours. Like, it's this kind of cushy job where you leave at 3 or something. But, reading your book, I realized like how far off that is from what the reality was for you.
Right. Yeah. Not even in the branches anymore. I mean, I'm sure that reputation came from, the branches open, whatever, 9 to 3. And so people think that, but that's a whole different part of the bank.
Well, they're mostly open longer now too, as
Yes.
well. So,
Hmm.
but you actually signed off on $50 billion. Was that
No, five. Yeah.
5 billion?
Well, yeah.
5 billion. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
that's a lot. Even that's a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, Lehman had been giving us collateral as the market got worse, the bank was demanding more collateral from all of its clients. And Lehman had given us a lot of collateral, but we disputed the value because for instance, they gave us $3 billion of bonds as collateral, and those bonds were rated AA, which is a good rating. But the AA rating was based on Lehman's guarantee of the bond. So, so it's like, you're guaranteeing your own IOU and you're going bankrupt. It's like it's not worth $3 billion because you're not there, you're not going to be able to backstop it. So we had a big disagreement about that. And yeah, so again, I was talking about the operating committee. So Jamie Dimon and all of his direct reports, and I was pulled into those meetings, but that's where it was decided that it was $5 billion. And somebody else was supposed to call the CEO of Lehman, and I was supposed to call my contract in the treasurer's department and tell them, you got to get this money to us in the morning or it's over. So, and they did. They got it to us. And so actually, we did continue to deal with the broker dealer. The Lehman parent company filed for bankruptcy, but that's a intricacy that your listeners don't need to know about.
So some of the decisions that were made, not by you, and you actually tried to stop some of them. We don't have to go into the details about what these decisions were. But some of the decisions put JP Morgan in a very difficult position. It has to do with those, with that collateral not being what it was supposed to be. And JP Morgan survived. You said that there were times when you weren't sure it would, but afterwards you ended up being blamed, even though you had actually tried to stop some of those decisions.
It was very interesting because, of course, everybody likes to do what they call them an autopsy. They like to do an autopsy afterwards. And I can remember meeting with the outside counsel, and they said, well, you know, half of the people think you're a savior and half of the people think you're responsible for the mess. It's like, so people have different ways of viewing the situation. And, what happens is politics take over. People want to survive they want to protect their jobs. Senior people want other people to pay for their mistakes sometimes. And so I I stayed until 2010, but I felt that I was fortunate because I really didn't want to do the job anymore. I was totally burnt out, and you know, I could have followed my ego that said, "Oh, I'm one of a few senior women at the bank. I could have strong-armed my way into a big paycheck and a big job." But I said, "I have an opportunity to get out." And so I took it, and I was really happy. I mean, I was not happy right away. I was exhausted, but I did. I started taking astrology classes, and I learned how to make stained glass, and I danced and I meditated and I, got up when I was finished sleeping, and I ate when I was hungry, and I napped when I wanted to, and it was a really wonderful healing time of my life.
In the aftermath of the collapse with Lehman, I think this is before you had left the company. the ARE comes back into your story again because you went to ARE headquarters in Virginia Beach looking for, you were still trying to find some kind of clarity about your life or some kind of comfort. And you talked to Mark Thurston, who at that time was on staff there. And it's interesting. You have a quote on your website now
Mhm.
where you say, when we know who we truly are, what to do becomes self-evident. And that's almost exactly what you have a different person.
Yeah, that's who Mark got it from. Bing Stern is where he got it
Yeah,
from. But
yeah, because
yes,
that's what basically Mark said to you.
yes, he did. I had separated from my husband. I had signed up for a life purpose course at the ARE, and I went down there and I found a few minutes to talk to Mark, and I, gave him my litany of woes. And, he was so sweet as he is. But he said, when we work with this concept that when we know who we truly are, what to do becomes self-evident. Because I was like, what should I do? I'm a mother, I'm a worker, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a blah, blah, blah. And he said, in fact, several avenues might open up to you. And so I said to him, well, that all sounds great. Like, how does that happen? And he said, well, my wife happens to teach a course. So I went back down there in December and I took my first course with PTCI, and I stepped into my first constellation and I created my first ideal. And yeah, my life has changed dramatically since that.
So backtracking, PTCI stands for,
Personal Transformation and Courage Institute. It was founded by Mark Thurston and his wife, Mary Elizabeth Lynch.
right, who we mentioned much earlier, but now we're coming back to them. And now we're cycling around back to them. So, yeah, you went to that. Mark told you about this weekend conference, or yeah, that his wife was doing and Mary Elizabeth was doing, and you attended that. And that seems to have been a catalyst for you connecting to a whole other path, so to speak.
Yes, yes, yes. It was both embodied experiential learning, which is very effective for me, and it was also introducing the concepts of ideals, mindfulness, and healthy will. And it's been a long journey, but I have learned so much, and it's changed my life completely.
So, could you just give a brief description of how some of that constellation works?
Sure. Constellations are, I think the easiest way to say it is they're like 3D representations of dynamics. So in family constellations, you might set up a situation. You say, okay, this is the day I found out my parents were moving to Hawaii, and this is where my dad was, this is where my mom was, this is, and you actually have people, they're called representatives, stand in those particular areas, and then you go around and you talk to them and you find out what does it feel like. And there it's sort of like morphic space. They can feel, oh, I feel excluded, I feel heard, I feel, there's a lot of different things. So in the PTCI work, what Mary Elizabeth did was adapted that to energies. So for instance, we go through a number of exercises to come up with the facets of our ideal, and we say, okay, so I'm joyful, I'm a community builder, there could be whatever the different aspects are. And then these people, you have people stand in the constellation with you and you feel that energy. And it goes to what I was talking about before about getting really grounded in our goodness and in our strengths, so that then we have the capacity to deal with our shadow side.
And the ideals at work. Ideals is a important Casey concept, but I'm not sure we have time to go into it in depth. But it's basically the idea that it's not exactly a purpose, because a life purpose might be, well, to become a doctor, but the ideal would be more like, why am I becoming a doctor? Because I want to be of service, because I want to express love, right? It would be.
Probably the easiest way to say it would be it's the spirit with which I want to do things.
Right. So the Casey Materials is very big on making those ideas conscious and setting it and putting it down on paper. And then you took that along with Mary Elizabeth Lynch and Wendy Raines, and you started an organization that would help businesses do that.
That's correct. We
And
had more success with nonprofits and sole proprietorships than we did with the corporate world. But we're really trying to translate those, really the ideals, the mindfulness, and the healthy will. And that's a whole nother program if we're going to talk about that, about those
I,
things.
yeah, I just wanted to at least touch on that so that, just to kind of show where all of this took you.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, it was wonderful. So I know you wanted to let people know where they could get in touch with me. I have two
Yes.
websites actually. I have one website is janebuyers.com, JANEBUYERS.com. And that's where I have my consulting business and my blog. And then I have another one, 8septembers.com, and it's eight spelled out, not the numeral eight. And that is just dedicated to the book. And there's links there for buy the book, and there's links to people's reviews and that sort of thing. A little bit of backstory.
And could you do the spell the one that's your website again slowly so that people can get that? Because when people think buyers, it's well, just spell it.
Yeah, it's JANEBUY, like the purchaser, BUYERS.com.
Yes.
Just my name, which is on the screen.
So just very quickly, now you're remarried, you're living in Florida, you have a pretty nice life. Is there any other new project in the offing? Anything?
Well, I'm trying my hand at fiction. And I decided that I don't want to do prescriptive nonfiction, but I did want to write about sort of spiritual growth and personal development. So, and I wanted to have the experience that fiction writers tell me they have, which is that their characters tell them what to do. So I have created a character, and she is an astrologer, and I don't know anything about the plot, but the overarching thing is that she goes from sort of, hawking street side readings to a more evolved, higher purpose, psychic world. So I don't know where it's going to go. It's very rough at the beginning, but I'm having some fun with it. And it's very nice not to be writing about my own story anymore.
So Hercules is letting us know that we need to wind it down. So you have given your contact information, and if anybody wants to reach me, you can reach me at info, that's INFO, at EDGARCaseyNYC.org. And I'll spell that also. It's info, INFO, at EDGARCAYCENYC.org. And so thank you so much, Jane. Thank
This
you,
was wonderful.
Hercules.
Thank you for having me on. It was really fun to talk to you, and I love it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you,
Thank you,
Hercules.
Hercules.
And thank you both for a wonderful and thoughtful show and a weird synchronicity. A couple of minutes before you started talking about macadamia nuts and a hunger for macadamia nuts. I went and grabbed some.
Very nice.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye.